You are at the panel session on climate-sensitive sanitation planning, as you can see, presented in collaboration between the Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association, or ESAWAS, and Athena Infonomics, which is where I'm from. This is a panel discussion presented in part by SIWI for World Water Week, showcasing tools and approaches. My name is Zachary Burt. I'll be the moderator today. I'm a senior economist at Athena. I work on issues of social inequity, access, and affordability, as well as climate adaptation, all in the WASH sector. Just a little bit of introduction. Today's discussion is going to focus on climate issues in the sanitation sector, covering both, hopefully, a little bit of mitigation as well as adaptation. I think, as everyone knows, climate is a pervasive and pressing issue. In terms of impacts, people are going to feel those impacts in the ways in which they interact with water. Many areas, especially cities along the coast, are projected to have an increase in storms, droughts, and floods. And in the sanitation sector, this means increased risks to people, to finances, and to infrastructure. At the same time, the sanitation sector is a huge user of energy. And so therefore, there's a lot of potential to reduce emissions through improved investment choices in this sector. Time permitting, we're going to try and cover the role of utilities, regulators, investors, and a little bit how they interact with NGOs and multilateral organizations. We've put together a panel which with representatives from organizations involved in investment, service delivery, and policy making. Drawing from their work experiences in the field, we hope to have a discussion about how climate and sanitation intersect and what we all need to be thinking about when trying to move the sanitation sector towards effective mitigation efforts and greater climate resilience. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If people have questions, please type them in the in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that. We're hoping to ask as many of those questions as possible. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on that along with my colleague Maya. We have three great panelists today. I'll introduce each of them. First, Eunice Chimfwembe is an environmental and social safeguard specialist at LWSC. That's the Lusaka Water Supply and Sanitation Company. She'll be discussing how LWSC has integrated climate adaptation into their strategic plan and how they've begun to implement climate resilience in their operations and in their customer engagement. Next is Kasenga Hara. He is a senior inspector at NWASCO, that's the National Water Supply and Sanitation Council in Zambia, and he's also the executive secretary at ESAWAS. He's heading up efforts to help regulators and utilities integrate climate considerations into water and sanitation investment planning, including development of this strategic climate resilience assessment methodology, which is a tool for utilities to use to assess their climate resilience. And last, Nathalie André is a Sanitation Policy Solutions specialist at GGGI, that's the Global Green Growth Institute. She'll talk a little bit about GGGI's efforts to expand low GHG sanitation options and share specific examples from their efforts to design climate-focused sanitation investments in Nepal and Senegal. Now, in order to introduce each of your work, I'd like to ask a couple of framing questions for each of you. Starting off with Nathalie, could you tell us a little bit about what kinds of things GGI is doing for mitigation through more climate-sensitive investment planning? What seems to be working and what are the challenges?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel, and thank you for the question. So GGGI, just to give a little bit of background, so we're embedded generally ministry level, so we're present in about 30 countries, and we work with the countries to help them in their efforts for climate change, so both attracting climate finance, but also trying to build resilience to climate change. So for sanitation, we've been looking at, thanks to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, building a pipeline of investment for sanitation that looks at mitigation, but also adaptation. And what seems to be working is working kind of in a dual way, both on policy, but also building on the pipeline to ensure that that the infrastructure can go ahead, because without the policy in place, we often can't attract the climate finance. And in terms of low mitigation solutions, so we're looking at large-scale commercial biogas in Nepal, where fecal sludge will be a feed. And for Senegal, we're looking more of a public-private partnership, where we'll be looking at reuse schemes to giving an alternative fuel which will, in effect, reduce GHG emissions for the country. So in a nutshell, that's the answer. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Nathalie. And we'll definitely get back to some of the examples from the work that you mentioned. Next, I'd like to turn to Kasenga. So could you talk a little bit about what ESAWAS is doing to equip utilities and regulators to integrate climate considerations in their investment planning?
Thank you very much, Zach, and good afternoon or good evening, good morning, whichever part of the world you are in, participants. So as introduced, my name is Kasenga Hara. I'm Executive Secretary at ESAWAS, that's the Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association. So ESAWAS is a network of regulators in this region, working together to enhance the way we do regulation, as well as capacity building, among other things. So there are a number of things that we are doing in response to the challenges that we're facing concerning climate change. And I'll talk about that in a short while. Perhaps let me take you to the slides and show exactly what we're doing. So I hope that you're able to see the slide. Are we?
Yeah, I can see them. I'm assuming everyone else can as well. Please continue, Kasenga.
Okay, so we've already begun to feel the impacts of climate change as a region in various forms. And I'll give a few examples. Sometime in 2018, the region was impacted by Cyclone Idai. It affected a number of countries, but most severely affected was Mozambique. The cyclone led to a lot of flooding in most parts of Mozambique, particularly Beira, and disrupted a number of services, including water and sanitation services. Other regions have begun to see impacts such as droughts, having below normal rainfall. For instance, in Zambia, where I sit, we've had this for quite some time now, and the country is heavily reliant on hydropower. So this affects not only water supply, but hydroelectricity again, and you know the energy and water nexus then is impacted. The projections in the region are that the weather periods are going to become shorter and shorter, but with chances of more intense rainfall, and obviously this leads to flooding. So this impacts on issues of sanitation in case wastewater plants flood, where you're on on-site sanitation, equally you would have flooding, and most parts of our region are actually heavily reliant on groundwater resources. So you're talking about cross-contamination also happening and compromising water quality. So it comes with a whole facets of challenges that we already have begun to experience. And in response, ESAWAS is putting up strategies to try and help the sector, the water sector, both the utilities and the regulators cope with some of these challenges. And this is what I'm going to go to soon. So we've done a high-level assessment using what we call a maturity matrix. And the matrix essentially was assessing the sector preparedness, the utility as well as regulators, in terms of the policies and the strategies, if the sector has had this in place, and whether the organizations were actually prepared to deal with the impacts of climate change, the issues of capacitation and performance management. Are we actually using any tools to measure or gauge if the impacts or projected impacts of climate change are being felt, and how best we deal with those? Also dealing with the issues of equity in the process, as well as investment, which is key. Are investments taking into account the climate risks or impacts that we are likely to get. So using this high-level assessment tool, the maturity matrix, the results across the region showed that though most member countries had actually cited climate change as one of those factors that are impacting them in their environmental policies, there was actually no strategy or specific strategies to deal with it, particularly for the water sector. And this becomes a problem because the governments will talk about climate change, but actually do not guide how best to deal with this particular issue. And it was also found that climate resilience appraisals were not really addressed in projects planning. So you do a project in the more traditional sense of using the impact assessments, but without consideration of the climate risk whatsoever. So a project is just done basically in response to the demand, either be it water or sanitation, and little to consider with climate change. We also found that there was actually little capacity and no linkages to the climate scientists who are actually supposed to give us this information as a sector, on which basis we make decisions. So with all that, we have decided to formulate what we're calling strategic climate resilience risk and response assessment methodology, which is essentially a suite of tools that utilities and regulators can use to enhance climate resilience. I'll just give a few examples. We're looking at water safety planning, enhancing this, but bringing in a more connotation on climate risks, assessments, and impacts. Of course, water safety plans do exist. A number of utilities across the world have used them, but the focus is much more on the operational side and nothing much to do with climate. So that is incorporation that we bring into this suite of tools. We're also looking at planning and design, risk assessment to ensure that whatever infrastructure is brought on board, be it water or sanitation, is actually climate proofed. When we talk about climate proofing sanitation infrastructure, for instance, we're using on-site sanitation facilities. In some cases where you have floods, these same pits might also be filled up, and eventually the effluent spills over and contaminates the immediate environment or even the groundwater resources. So the response there is obviously raising a little bit of these structures, but these are planning tools that we plan to put in place. We're looking also into extreme event management, predictive models, for instance. But obviously this requires a linkage with climate experts or departments such as the meteorology departments or even city planning, and also enhancing aspects of catchment management. But basically it's a suite of tools in this, what we're calling a Scrum, that we feel once implemented, or once these tools are fully developed, they can really help to enhance climate resilience of our sectors. In addition, we've been working in collaboration with a number of partners on developing what we're calling a citywide inclusive sanitation services assessment planning tool, or Siwa Sub2. And this is essentially a decision support tool, mostly on sanitation investment, but will take into account aspects of coverage, affordability, viability of systems that are chosen vis-a-vis implementation of sanitation projects. But we are also working to enhance this particular tool to include aspects of climate indicators. So we're looking at the relationship, correlationship, for instance, between water and energy. As I referred to earlier on, the water energy nexus is something that, especially in our region, intertwines very much because we're so much reliant, especially for energy input, on hydroelectricity across most of our countries. So these two will obviously help us in decision-making, not only the regulators, but also development partners, the politician, more importantly, to choose wisely or select options that have all these considerations in terms of viability, in terms of climate resilience, and in terms of sustainability and equity as well, right across the CUS principles, I should say. There are also other innovations that we're doing as regulators before we even complete the Scrum tools. We're looking at enhancing what we've traditionally done with utilities that we regulate, enhancing or improving upon the guidelines that we've developed on energy efficiency. So I think I shouldn't be led by this point because I've already mentioned the importance of energy in our region vis-a-vis water connection. But more importantly, as regulators, we're also looking to formulating benchmarks, for instance, for the greenhouse emissions, and also the topic I've just touched on, energy efficiency, into our reporting frameworks. This is important in that much as the government will give us guidance on how, general guidance on dealing with climate change, we actually do not have benchmarks to move towards. So the government will say, commit in the national communication plans to say we're going to reduce GHGs by about, maybe argument sake, 20%. But some of these targets are not sector specific. And for us regulators, our role is to ensure that each and every utility or each and every subsector contributes to the reduction in these emissions, and we set targets for ourselves that eventually feed into these national communication plans that the government mandates us to report on. We also using tools such as the ECAM. This is an open source tool. I believe many people have used it. It's essentially for energy assessment, but also carbon emission assessment. And we are piloting this particular tool, for instance, in Zambia in the utilities, just to really find out where we can optimize in terms of energy usage and where we can make a contribution towards mitigation measures. We also envisage that we need to do a lot of cross-institutional collaboration and capacity building. So we're mandating the utilities at least to have a focal point that is primarily our contact person for any climate change aspects that we are doing. I think that at this point I wish to rest here. And obviously if there are any clarifications or anything that I need to supplement on, I'll be glad to do so.
Great, thank you so much, Kasenga, for that very thorough introduction to the exciting work that ESAWAS is doing. I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions asking you more details about all of that. So now I think I'd like to just, briefly go over to Eunice. So I was lucky enough to have a more in-depth conversation with Eunice recently about the work that she's doing over at LWSC. So Eunice, could you spend a few minutes just talking a little bit about your experience and your observations and in how LWSC is integrating climate considerations into their strategic plans? And in particular, maybe if you could touch upon any learnings that you might provide to other utilities looking to integrate climate into their strategic plan as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Zach. Greetings to everyone. My name is Eunice Chimfwembe, as already introduced. I'm an environmental and social safeguard specialist working with Lusaka Water, and I work specifically under Lusaka Sanitation Program. So my job generally involves protection of the environment in all aspects of project implementation. So I'll share a bit an overview of what we're doing at Lusaka Water. So the impacts of climate change have not spared the water and sanitation sector, and we have not been spared as an institution. So we've also gone through impacts such as droughts as well as floods. And so the institution identified climate change and climate variability as an environmental risk in its strategic plan for 2018 to 2022. And upon doing that, some of the responses that came out was that an enterprise risk management policy was developed, as well as a committee. In this committee, it has different levels of staff at different operation levels who are in this committee, and they've got a lot of tasks. One of them includes raising awareness of the organizational risks, some which include climate change. And also, we have also developed a risk register, of course, to capture all other organizational risks as well as climate change risks. So from there, under the Lusaka Sanitation Program, we have developed a document called Climate and Climate Variability Plan, as well as a disaster and risk, which focuses on preparedness and management. And these risks are also biased to, disasters and risks are biased to climate change. They are climate change induced. So these two were developed under the project, and I managed the consultants who were developing this. And recommendations were made from these plans. And some of them were mitigation, others were adaptation measures. And these measures have now been picked by the institution, and we are now domesticating them. Some of the measures that came up were to, for instance, strengthen the embankments of sewer ponds, so that in case of a flood or strong surges, at least to be able to withstand. And we are also promoting construction of lined pitcher trees, so that in the past we would have pitcher trees which are not lined, and when it rains or it floods, they'll easily cave in, and they were a danger to underground water. There are also other recommendations that came to do with dislodging of the ponds, as well as in those areas that are flood prone, that we should actually raise the manholes as we construct them, so that in case of a flood, at least we'll not have all the storm water getting into the network and all the debris, as it would seriously disturb the network. So these are some of the measures that were identified, and some of them are already actually being implemented, especially under the project. We're already doing this. We're already promoting these pit latrines I've talked about in most of these communities. We are already, any other manholes that we are doing under the project, we are putting in those climate resilience considerations. Apart from that, another assessment that was done was on how climate change is going to, the impacts of climate change, it's going to affect the society, the communities. So you realize that our infrastructure is in the community, and these are the people that we are saving. So these are major stakeholders. So we have actually also a plan where we actually go out and engage these communities to also raise awareness on impacts of climate change in relation to water and sanitation, how it's affecting them, and how it will affect us as an institution. So we've been going out to have meetings with them to explain what climate change is and the impacts that might come. And sometimes they'll now realize to say, oh, okay, so this is what happened when we had a flood or when we had a drought. This is what it meant. We're also reaching out to raise awareness on the use of water in an event of drought. So we talk about reuse, for instance, gray water. You know, sometimes in these communities, they'll just throw it out on the ground and things like that. But these are now situations we're trying to explain to say, in fact, when we have a drought or we have stress on water, we can actually use gray water to help us in the sanitation, like to use it in the toilet and things like that. So these are some of the activities that we are doing.
Great, thank you, Eunice. I think that those are really interesting and I think potentially exciting, concrete examples of how service providers can start integrating climate right now in their immediate plans. So thank you all for your introductions. Now I'd like to try and dive just a little bit deeper. And so I want to ask a question which is a little bit broad, open-ended, so please use this question to go into a little bit deeper into the work that you're doing. Eunice, you're talking about engaging with communities. Kasenga, you're obviously directly dealing with utilities and regulators. And then Nathalie, you were also talking about not just specific projects aimed at mitigation, but also creating a policy framework around your work and how that creates the base of the work that you're doing. So in each of these areas, what are the new relationships that regulators, policymakers, sanitation authorities need to build in order to address climate effectively, either resilience or mitigation or both? You know, I'm thinking about NGOs and CBOs, but I'm also thinking about other government agencies, multilaterals, anything that you might have run across. These are big questions, and I'm sure that they require lots of different kinds of experts and coalitions and resources. So what are the bridges that need to be built? Maybe could I start with, well, please, any of you jump in as you like, but maybe I could start with Nathalie if you
Sure.
have ideas on that.
Sure. So as you mentioned, we've been developing a framework. I think so. Basically, we're working at national level. We're looking. So Kasenga mentioned the NDC is something that we're working on specifically in Nepal. So integrating sanitation into the NDC. And to do so, we're working with actors that haven't necessarily worked before. So the water and sanitation, the Ministry of Water, that includes the Department of Sanitation, hasn't been involved so much with climate issues, and it took some talking into. They quickly understood the importance of including it into the NDC, but they hadn't really been the big actors on the table in the NDC, in the NDC so far. So we'll bring them on the table, giving them arguments for them to present, and this is happening. So we're quite excited that it's moving in the right direction. In Senegal, they already had a good NDC where sanitation was included, but fecal sludge management wasn't. So we're working on that. And again, bringing in different actors that are sometimes maybe not on the table. Then we're also looking at a local level. So we've, in both countries, we've worked slightly differently. So in Nepal, we've worked with a partner organization called EMFO, greening the SIWIS. And so a little like my colleagues have mentioned today, looking at different pathways and what the impact is in terms of GHG emissions and adaptation. And in Senegal, GGGI had already developed a Green Cities framework, which is what we've been working with. And there it really brings lots of different stakeholders together to talk about different issues, and sanitation is one of them. And the fact that we have the forestry people, the town planners, the Women's Group, all talking together to come up with the challenges, the bottlenecks, and possible solutions. It's similar to the SIWIS approach, but a little bit tailored for the Senegal context, and it's brought some very interesting directions, and we feel it's going to be implemented because of this kind of mass bottom-up approach as well. So that's it for me.
Great, thank you so much for that. Yeah, Kasenga, please. Sorry.
Thanks so much. So in what I mentioned earlier on, in the development of the tools, some of the tools, especially the risk screening tools or assessment tools, obviously entail that there's a lot of cooperation that's required among organizations or agencies. For instance, the Met. In some of these tools or even predictive models, sometimes you might want to rely on the local knowledge as well, so involving the communities. For instance, there are certain instances where the community will tell you that, well, this particular stream always dries every 20 years or so, or there's always flooding here and so on. So that local knowledge is also something that you would want to tap in. So there are a number of stakeholders. The environmental bodies are equally very, very important, especially when you look at the entire sanitation value chain. You're looking at containment, you're also looking at the end of it in terms of disposal. So there are also impacts other than climate related that are environmental related, and the environmental bodies are equally important in this. And in most of our countries in this region, it's actually the environmental bodies that are required to eventually report on things like nationally determined contributions, the national communication report. So all these sectors are feeding into these particular bodies. So yes, it's very, very important to develop relationships, one for information sharing, but also for regulation purposes. There are times when you need joint enforcement. So there are also other actors like the local authority that are very, very important in terms of planning and planning permission, be it on water, be it on sanitation, and also climate related. So we envisage to have a lot of stakeholders involved in our processes. At the end of it all, we also need to communicate. So we need also some organizations or NGOs to help us with the communication and help send the information through the communities, even to help change mindset on some of these subjects.
Great, thank you, Kasenga. Eunice, I just want to give you the chance if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, most of the stakeholders have already been mentioned, but like I said earlier, we are already engaging so much with the community, and I just wanted to emphasize that actually the information that you get from the community also really helps a lot, because these are lived experiences. These are people who have experienced these things, and when you try to get information from them, you're already getting buy-in from the community, such that if this information is used later to develop policy or any other decision, then you will have already gotten that buy-in from the community, which is very, very important, because then in terms of implementation, it will be very easy because you already consulted them and they already actually had that buy-in. So of course, the local authority is key, of course, environmental bodies. And in this same community engagements that we're carrying out, we actually also have churches represented. We have churches represented. We have other community organizations represented. So already we are already engaging with these people, and they're actually helping so much in terms of spreading the word and also raising awareness on our effects of climate change.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Eunice. I think that emphasizing the importance of participating with the people who are going to be impacted, both for information as well as enforcement, as Kasenga was saying, really resonates from both of your work. So I just want to remind all of the audience members, please type in your questions. We're going to try and get to as many of them as we can in the Q&A box. One of the questions that's been brought up by an audience member, it's also something that I have here. This is for Kasenga. So what factors are most important to consider? Maybe you can just highlight a couple of key ones when making decisions regarding technologies or making decisions regarding management infrastructures, service models, what have you. I mean, for all of those broader planning decisions, what are some of the key factors to consider? What are the indicators that you look at? In particular, an audience member was interested in the water and energy nexus, but I think also just in general in making these decisions, what are the things that everyone should be paying attention to?
Thanks so much, Zach, for that question. So this particular question, I think, is multifaceted and actually depends on the sort of decision that you want to make. Because what I heard from you, you're also talking about the management structures, all right? So if you're making a decision solely on base technology to service people, be it water or sanitation, then there are a number of factors that you need to consider. Factors such as acceptability of that particular technology, especially sanitation and on-site sanitation, because people obviously need a say and you need to engage them. That is very, very important. Otherwise, as a developer or stakeholder, you'd go ahead and make a project which actually just becomes a white elephant. I do recall when I worked in the Pacific in Nauru, and at that point in time, we're looking at one of these on-site sanitation options, composting toilets, that time of the ecological sanitation. And we were, the funder at that point in time was trying to promote some other form of technology. And then the community itself in the end really resisted that because they were used to some other form and almost became messy. So it's very, very important that you engage people for acceptability purposes. But you're also looking at the financial viability of whatever option you're considering. You're looking at the sustainability of the decision that you've made, the equity as well. Is it well or encompassing or not? So basically you're looking at the SIWI's principles, essentially right across those 6 principles: sustainability, responsiveness, accountability, and obviously the viability I've already mentioned to be able to inform a decision. But when you look at the management structure, it's kind of a political decision in some cases that has to be made. Is this particular infrastructure going to be managed by the community, or is it an infrastructure going to be managed by the local authority? I guess this is what this question refers to when you talk about management structures, because essentially you're talking about who is actually owning this and who manages it, who manages operation, maintenance, and so on. So these are some of these are political considerations that have to be made depending on how a particular sector is set up. And there are very various models that I could give from Zambia or right across the ESAWAS region on some of the modes that do exist. But essentially, there's also that political connotation that you may have to consider.
Great, thanks, Kasenga. Yeah,
that suffices.
This is such a huge issue and it's so complicated. I mean, I think it's a Herculean task to ask you to summarize things in a couple of minutes, but I think you've touched on points that I'm sure resonate with a lot of people in the audience. I mean, I think it's really, all of the things that you brought up are really important. So thanks for highlighting that. And it's also good to hear that, you know, based on your own on the ground experience. So thank you for that. Natalie, I'd like to pose a quick question for you. What are some clear opportunities for climate mitigation in sanitation? And so that's the broader, more simple question, but in addition to that, if there are examples of this, how can these projects also build on whatever's happening on the ground already in terms of increasing access, in terms of improving access, improving services overall? And are there, this is an interesting question that came from an audience member, are there other considerations other than just energy consumption? So I know that Kartik Chandran at Columbia University has been looking at emissions from incomplete or ineffective or inefficient treatment processes and how those might contribute. I'm sure that's part of the considerations when we're talking about biogas generation. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about some combined win-wins between climate mitigation and resilience, if they're there. What are the big wins for climate mitigation in general? And what are there things that we can consider beyond just energy consumption?
Sure.
Sorry, I know that.
No, it's a good question. When we first started looking at solutions for both Nepal and Senegal, climate was always the climate was always in the back of our mind, but we also had to look at the other issues on the ground, and at municipality level, solid waste is also an issue. So we actually found that by combining those issues and providing a solution that combines both solid waste and fecal sludge waste, we both increase the appeal for the municipalities, but we also greatly reduce GHG emissions. So that was one thing we saw, and then just financially, it just also made a lot more sense. So that we were able to do more in Nepal, but otherwise we're also working with a consortium, the University of Bristol, Leeds, and Sydney. We're going to be looking at the cactus methodology that they've also developed to look at the different GHG emissions from across the chain, so the containment, transport, and reuse, and doing some detailed assessment in different contexts. So it's over 5 countries. We're going to be working with them in Nepal and Senegal, but they're working in other countries too. And really getting to grips, because right now the UNFCCC methodologies don't cover the whole chain per se. We have to do some patchwork to kind of assess what the GHG emissions are at each stage. And it does seem that the containment is an issue for one, if it's leaking. It's an issue for GHG emissions, but if it's also just regularly treated, we're reducing those anaerobic conditions to create the methane. So we're reducing GHG emissions just by treating it, which is like a great sell from a climate perspective. And then from an adaptation perspective as well, as mentioned by my colleagues on the panel, the flooding into these containment systems, they're not hermetic right now. Then the pathogens within the water sources, and then we have problems throughout the municipality. So we are looking at each element to see what we can see for both adaptation and mitigation, but kind of the bottom line is to fix the sanitation.
Oh, sorry, Nathalie, you just froze up at the end there, but I think you were just finishing up. So thank you for that comment. Hopefully you can, oh, I think you're back. Sorry. I don't know if Zoom cut you off there.
So I'm not sure what point it cut me off. I was talking away happily, and then I saw your face freeze. So I'm not sure if I've been talking to myself the last 10 minutes. So I am happy to repeat. At one point, did I lose you?
It was just about 5 seconds ago. I think it was just at the end. Yeah.
Okay. So no need to repeat. Great.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. So we just have 2 minutes left. So unfortunately, I don't think that we have too much time. I don't think we have time to do all of the questions that we've gotten, but just very quickly, Eunice, there was a question here talking about investment, and I know that you have not. You're in charge of more social issues. You're not in charge of investments per se, but are there certain revenue shortfalls that are projected? Are there certain investment gaps that you've seen in trying to implement some of these climate resilient projects?
Sure. Yeah, we've identified the adaptation measures as well as the mitigation measures, but you agree with me that some mitigation measures would need financing, and these are some of the challenges that we have, because we have a lot of competing needs. So the finances might not be there to implement some of these measures that have been identified. So that's a real challenge. So because we need financial resources to invest in some of these measures. So right now, this is one of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always a challenge, but especially when it comes to upgrading systems to be more climate resilient. So I think we're at time. So I just want to take a little bit of extra time to thank all of our panelists so much for joining and giving a little bit of your experiences. I wish we had more time to learn more from all the things that you're doing. Thank you for joining from all over the world. Thank you, Nathalie, for joining even late at such a late hour where you're at. Thank you to all of our audience members that fielded questions. The questions that you put in were really great. I wish that I had more time to ask more of them. I tried to fit in as many as possible. If people have more questions, please feel free to reach out. My colleague Maya is going to put up some contact information